Before you open it, Margaret, there's something about me you need to understand. Those were the words my husband spoke to me on the night of our 40th wedding anniversary. And even now, when I think back to that moment, I can still hear the soft music from the restaurant, the clinking of wine glasses, and the quiet laughter from the other tables, as if nothing unusual was happening at all. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I'm 63 years old, and until that evening I believed I had lived a simple, ordinary life built on love, patience, and the quiet routines that come with a long marriage. Daniel and I had been together for 4 decades. 40 years of birthdays, road trips, Sunday breakfasts, and small arguments over things like where to hang a picture or which brand of coffee tasted better. Our children were grown, our grandchildren visited often, and by every measure I thought we were one of those couples people point to when they say, "That's what a lasting marriage looks like." That night we were sitting in a small restaurant just outside Hartford, Connecticut, a place Daniel and I had visited many times before. The dining room was warm and softly lit, the kind of place where the waiters remember your favorite dish and the pianist in the corner plays familiar songs from decades past. I remember thinking how peaceful everything felt. Daniel looked handsome in his navy jacket, his silver hair neatly combed, and when he smiled at me across the table, I felt the same warmth I had felt the first time we met when I was 23 years old. Our server brought a small chocolate cake with 2 candles, and Daniel reached across the table to hold my hand, while everyone around us applauded politely, the way strangers sometimes do when they see an older couple celebrating something meaningful. I thought the night couldn't be more perfect. After the candles were blown out and the cake was cut, Daniel reached down beside his chair and lifted a small rectangular box onto the table. I smiled immediately because I assumed it was jewelry. Daniel had a habit of giving thoughtful gifts on anniversaries, and I teased him by saying, "Daniel Whitmore, you didn't have to buy me anything fancy." But instead of smiling back the way he usually did, he looked at me with a strange seriousness I couldn't quite place. The music continued playing softly in the background, but the air between us felt different somehow, heavier. Daniel slid the box toward me slowly. "Go ahead," he said quietly. I opened it expecting to see velvet or something sparkling, but instead I saw a thick envelope filled with documents. At first I thought it must be something practical, maybe insurance papers or a new investment he wanted to show me. Daniel had always handled most of our paperwork. I lifted the envelope and noticed it was heavier than I expected. "Daniel," I said with a small laugh, "did you get me paperwork for our anniversary?" But he didn't laugh. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, resting his hands together on the table, and that was when he said the sentence that made my stomach tighten with confusion. "Before you read it," he said gently, "I need you to understand that I only discovered this a few months ago." I stared at him, unsure what he meant. My fingers slipped the first document from the envelope. It looked like an official record, something old but carefully preserved. I saw dates, signatures, and a family name that felt strangely familiar, though I couldn't immediately understand why. The restaurant around us continued moving as normal. People ordering drinks, forks tapping against plates, quiet conversations filling the room. But for me the world had suddenly narrowed to the paper in my hands and the anxious expression on my husband's face. I kept reading, slowly at first, then faster as the meaning of the words began to form in my mind like a puzzle assembling itself piece by piece. My heart began to beat harder with every line I read. Finally I looked up at Daniel, my voice barely louder than a whisper, and asked the only question I could manage. "Daniel, why does this document say your father's name was Richard Hayes?" The moment those words left my mouth, Daniel closed his eyes for a second, as if preparing himself for something inevitable, and when he opened them again, the look in his face told me that the quiet, peaceful life I believed I understood was about to change in a way I never could have imagined. I remember staring at Daniel across that small restaurant table, the paper still trembling slightly in my hands as if my fingers no longer fully belonged to me. The name Richard Hayes sat there on the document like a quiet but undeniable fact, printed clearly in black ink beside Daniel's name, and the moment I saw it my mind immediately returned to a man I had not thought about in many years. Richard Hayes had been the man my mother married after my father passed away when I was still a teenager. He had never been cruel or unkind, but he had always felt like a stranger living inside our home, a man who kept to himself and spoke in careful, polite sentences that never quite crossed the invisible distance between us. I had not seen him in more than 40 years. He died not long after I left for college, and eventually his name became little more than a quiet memory in the back of my mind. Yet now, somehow, his name was printed on a legal document connected to the man I had been married to for 4 decades. I looked up again at Daniel, hoping he would say something that would make the entire situation suddenly simple and easy to understand. But instead he just watched me with the same steady, serious expression he had been wearing since he gave me the envelope. The soft piano music continued behind us, and a couple at the next table laughed about something as their waiter brought them dessert, completely unaware that the ground beneath my life felt as if it had shifted several inches to the side. "Daniel," I said slowly, trying to keep my voice calm even though my thoughts were racing. "Richard Hayes was my stepfather." The moment those words left my mouth, Daniel nodded once, gently, as if confirming something he already knew would be difficult for me to accept. "I know," he replied quietly. For a few seconds, I simply stared at him, waiting for the rest of the explanation, because surely there had to be more. Documents like this did not appear out of nowhere. Names like that did not simply land on a piece of paper by accident. I lowered my eyes again and began looking more carefully through the rest of the pages inside the envelope. There were several records, some older than others, including what appeared to be a birth certificate and a series of family registration documents that had been copied and certified. One of them listed Daniel's full name at birth, Daniel Hayes, along with a date and place that surprised me. It said he had been born in a small town in Pennsylvania, nearly 600 miles from where we were sitting that evening. In all our years together, Daniel had always said he grew up in Ohio with an aunt after his parents passed away early in his childhood. That was the story he told when we first met, and it was the story he had repeated over the years whenever someone asked about his family history. Now, suddenly, the papers in front of me suggested something very different. "Daniel," I whispered again, feeling the weight of every year we had shared together pressing on my chest. "Why does this say your last name used to be Hayes?" He took a slow breath before answering, the kind of breath someone takes when they know the truth they are about to speak will permanently change the direction of a conversation. "Because it was," he said quietly. "Margaret, when I was born, my name was Daniel Hayes." I felt a strange chill move through my shoulders, even though the restaurant was warm. Hayes was not a common coincidence in my life. Hayes was the last name of the man who married my mother when I was 16 years old. Hayes was the name that had appeared on the mailbox outside the house where I finished high school. Hayes was the name printed on the medical bills and tax papers my mother kept in a drawer in the kitchen. And now it was the name that once belonged to my husband. I slowly set the documents back on the table between us and leaned back in my chair, trying to collect my thoughts in a way that would allow them to make sense. "Daniel," I said carefully, "are you telling me that your father and my stepfather were the same man?" He looked directly at me and gave another small, steady nod. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly what I am telling you." For a moment the sounds of the restaurant seemed to fade into the background, as if the room had quietly stepped several feet away from our table. 40 years of memories began rushing through my mind all at once. Our wedding day in a small church outside Boston, the day our first child was born, the summer vacations by Lake Michigan, the quiet evenings sitting on the porch after dinner talking about the future we believed we understood. And now, suddenly, a question I never imagined asking began forming in my mind with terrifying clarity. If Richard Hayes had been Daniel's father, and Richard Hayes had also been the man who married my mother, then there was only one conclusion my heart could reach. I looked at Daniel again, my voice barely steady enough to form the words. "Daniel, does that mean we might be family?" I could feel my heartbeat in my ears as the question left my mouth, and for a moment Daniel did not answer. He simply looked at me across the small round table, the candle between us flickering softly, as if even the flame understood that something fragile was hanging in the air. Around us the restaurant continued with its quiet evening rhythm, waiters moving from table to table, glasses being refilled, a couple near the window taking photographs of their dessert. But inside my mind, everything had slowed down to a single unbearable thought. Family. The word echoed again and again as I tried to understand how it could possibly belong in the same sentence as the man I had loved for 40 years. Daniel finally reached forward and gently rested his hand on top of the documents, not taking them away from me, but steadying them as if he knew how much they were shaking. "Margaret," he said quietly. "That was the first question I asked too." His voice was calm, but there was a tired weight behind it, the sound of someone who had been carrying a difficult truth alone for a long time. I swallowed slowly, trying to keep my thoughts from running too far ahead of the facts in front of me. "You said you only discovered this a few months ago," I reminded him. "How?" Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair and took a deep breath before answering, glancing briefly around the restaurant as if choosing his words carefully. "Last winter," he began, "I ordered one of those genealogy kits online. It was supposed to be something simple. You know how our granddaughter Emily has been interested in family history for her school project. She asked if anyone in the family had ever done one of those DNA tests." I remembered that conversation clearly. Emily had been sitting at our kitchen table with a notebook and a laptop, asking questions about grandparents and great-grandparents while drawing a family tree that stretched across several pages. At the time, it had seemed like an innocent school assignment, the kind children do every year. Daniel continued speaking, his eyes focused on the candlelight between us. I sent the sample in, and a few weeks later the results came back. At first everything looked normal. It listed relatives I already knew about and places in Europe where my ancestors probably lived. But then I received a message through the genealogy website from someone I had never heard of. He paused for a moment, and I noticed his fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the envelope. "The message came from a man in Pennsylvania," Daniel said slowly. "He said our DNA results suggested we were closely related. At first I thought it had to be a mistake, but when we started comparing information, he mentioned the name Richard Hayes. Hearing that name again made my chest tighten. The pieces of the story were beginning to move together in ways I was not ready to accept. I asked him why he thought that name mattered," Daniel continued, "and he told me Richard Hayes was his uncle. That was when I started looking into it more carefully. I lowered my eyes to the documents again, noticing the official seals and certified stamps that proved someone had gone to considerable effort to verify these records. "So you hired someone to investigate," I said quietly. Daniel nodded. "A professional genealogist. I needed to know whether the information was real or just some strange coincidence." For several seconds neither of us spoke. The piano player in the corner shifted into another familiar melody, something soft and nostalgic that reminded me of dances from decades ago. Finally, I forced myself to ask the question that still hung between us like a fragile thread. "And what did the investigation find?" Daniel's eyes met mine again, steady but full of concern. "It confirmed that Richard Hayes was my biological father," he said gently. "The records show that after he left Pennsylvania, he eventually moved to Connecticut. A few years later, he met your mother." My breath caught slightly as the timeline aligned in my mind. My mother had married Richard Hayes when I was 16 years old, long after Daniel and I had already started dating in college. At the time, none of us could have imagined any connection between our families. Still, one piece of the puzzle remained painfully unclear. I leaned forward slightly and spoke in a voice that barely rose above the quiet music around us. "Daniel," I asked slowly, "does that mean we share the same father, or does it mean something else entirely?" I watched Daniel carefully as he considered my question, and for a long moment the only sound between us was the quiet piano music drifting through the restaurant and the faint murmur of conversations from other tables. Daniel slowly reached for one of the documents in the envelope and turned it so I could see a particular section more clearly under the candlelight. His finger rested beside a printed date and a name I did not recognize. "Margaret," he said gently, "the investigation shows that Richard Hayes was my biological father, but he was not yours." I blinked several times, trying to process the words. For a moment my mind struggled to understand the difference, because the situation was still tangled in a way that felt impossible to sort out. Daniel seemed to sense my confusion and continued speaking carefully, choosing each sentence as if he had rehearsed it many times before this evening. "Your father was William Carter," he reminded me softly. "Richard Hayes only became part of your family years later when he married your mother after your father passed away." I felt a small breath leave my chest as that detail settled into place. My father had died when I was 14 years old, and for 2 years my mother had raised me alone before she met Richard Hayes. Their marriage had always felt like a second chapter in our lives, one that began long after my childhood had already been shaped by another man entirely. Daniel watched my expression closely as the realization slowly formed in my mind. That means we do not share the same parents, he said quietly. There is no biological connection between us. I leaned back slightly in my chair, absorbing the explanation while the tension in my shoulders eased just enough to allow me to breathe again. Yet the situation still carried a strange emotional weight that I could not easily dismiss. Even if we did not share blood, the idea that the same man had once been both Daniel's father and my stepfather created a link between our pasts that neither of us had ever known about. So technically, I said slowly, still trying to understand the shape of the truth, you were the son of the man who later married my mother. Daniel nodded once. Yes, he answered, which means that for a short period of time, before we ever met each other, you and I were connected through him as step-siblings. The phrase sounded strange in my ears, not because it suggested anything improper in our marriage, but because it rewrote the quiet history I thought I understood. For 40 years, Daniel and I had believed our families were completely separate, two different stories that happened to meet when we fell in love in college. Now it turned out that our lives had brushed past each other much earlier, through a man neither of us had fully known. I looked down again at the documents, tracing the printed names with my eyes. When did you find out all of this exactly? I asked. Daniel folded his hands together on the table. About 3 months ago, he said. The genealogist confirmed the records and helped track down the timeline of Richard Hayes's life. It turns out he had a family in Pennsylvania before he moved east and eventually met your mother. The thought made me pause. In all the years I lived in the same house as Richard Hayes, he had rarely spoken about his past. He was polite, reserved, and always slightly distant, as though part of his life existed somewhere far away that he preferred not to discuss. My mother never mentioned that he had a son, I said quietly. Daniel gave a small nod. According to the records, Richard Hayes left Pennsylvania when I was still a child. After that, I was raised by my aunt in Ohio. That is why our families never crossed paths when you were growing up. I sat silently for a few seconds, remembering the quiet man who had once lived in our home and wondering how many pieces of his life had remained hidden behind his careful smile. Finally, I looked back at Daniel and asked the question that had been lingering since he first handed me the envelope. Why did you choose tonight to tell me all of this? Daniel's eyes softened slightly, and he reached across the table to gently take my hand. Because tonight marks 40 years of honesty between us, he said quietly, and I could not let another anniversary pass while carrying a secret that belonged to both of us. Daniel's words settled between us like a quiet promise, but even as his hand held mine across the table, my thoughts were still moving through the past, trying to reshape memories that had once seemed so simple. 40 years of marriage had taught me that truth rarely arrives all at once. It usually comes slowly, like light creeping into a dark room, revealing details that were always there, but never fully noticed. I looked again at the envelope resting between us, realizing that the documents inside it were not meant to destroy the life we had built together, but to explain a hidden chapter that had existed long before either of us knew the other. You said the investigation traced Richard Hayes's life? I said gently. What else did they find? Daniel shifted slightly in his chair and pulled another sheet of paper from the envelope. This one looked older than the others, its edges faintly yellowed even though it had been carefully copied. This is a census record from Pennsylvania, he explained quietly. It shows my father living there with my mother when I was very young. I studied the page, noticing the names and dates arranged in neat columns. The world described on that paper felt distant and unfamiliar, like a story from someone else's life. Yet somehow it was tied to both Daniel and me in ways we had never imagined. My mother died when I was 7, Daniel continued. After that, my father struggled to raise me alone. Eventually, my aunt took me in and brought me to Ohio. I nodded slowly, remembering the version of that story Daniel had told me years earlier. At the time, it had sounded like a sad but straightforward childhood. Now I understood that there had always been missing pieces. Did your father ever try to contact you again after you moved? I asked. Daniel shook his head gently. No. According to the genealogist, he left Pennsylvania not long after that. He moved several times before eventually settling in Connecticut. Hearing that detail made a strange realization unfold in my mind. Connecticut was where my mother met Richard Hayes. It was where she introduced him to me one quiet autumn evening when I was 16 years old. I could still picture the moment clearly. My mother had invited him to dinner, and he arrived carrying a small bouquet of yellow flowers. He was polite, well-dressed, and spoke in a calm, careful voice that made him seem older than he actually was. At the time, I had simply assumed he was a man who wanted a second chance at happiness after a difficult life. I never imagined that somewhere else in the country he had once been the father of a young boy who would eventually become my husband. I lived in the same house with him for almost 2 years, I said softly, still amazed by the strange path our lives had taken. And yet you and I never met during that time. Daniel gave a small, thoughtful smile. Life has a way of crossing paths without people realizing it, he said. You were finishing high school then, and I was already in college in Ohio. Our worlds were close, but they never actually touched. I looked around the restaurant again, noticing how ordinary everything still seemed despite the extraordinary truth unfolding at our table. A waiter walked past carrying a tray of glasses, and a family near the door was laughing about something one of their children had said. It was strange how the world continued moving forward even when your understanding of the past had just changed forever. Do you regret telling me tonight? I asked quietly after a moment. Daniel's expression softened immediately. No, he answered without hesitation. I was nervous, but I never doubted that you deserved to know. His voice carried the same honesty that had drawn me to him all those years ago. I realized then that the man sitting across from me was still the same person who had stood beside me through every challenge our life had presented. The discovery we were discussing did not change the kindness in his eyes or the steady patience that had shaped our marriage. 40 years is a long time, Daniel said gently, and every one of those years was real. I squeezed his hand slightly, feeling a quiet sense of clarity beginning to replace the confusion I had felt earlier in the evening. The truth about Richard Hayes had altered the map of our past, but it had not erased the life Daniel and I had built together. Still, one question remained in my mind, something deeper than records or family timelines. I looked at him thoughtfully and asked, Daniel, when you first learned all of this, what did you feel? Daniel did not answer my question right away. Instead, he looked down at the table for a moment, as if searching through memories that were not easy to explain in a single sentence. The candlelight reflected softly in his eyes, and I could see that the discovery had affected him more deeply than he had allowed himself to show earlier in the evening. Finally, he took a slow breath and looked back at me. At first, he said quietly, I felt confused. Not frightened, not ashamed, just confused. It was like learning that a chapter of your life had been written long before you knew it existed. I listened carefully as he spoke, noticing the calm steadiness in his voice. Daniel had always been the kind of man who thought carefully before reacting to anything important. That patience was one of the reasons our marriage had lasted so long. When the DNA results first suggested a connection to the Hayes family, he continued, I assumed it was a distant relative somewhere in the country. That kind of thing happens all the time with those genealogy tests. But when the investigator confirmed that Richard Hayes was my father and that he later married your mother, I had to sit down for a long time just to think about what it meant. I nodded slowly, imagining him alone in his study at home, reading through records that slowly rewrote the past we believed we understood. Did you worry about what it meant for us? I asked gently. Daniel gave a small, thoughtful smile. Of course I did, he replied. 40 years of marriage deserves careful thought before sharing something like this. I wanted to be absolutely certain about the facts before I said a single word to you. His hand rested calmly over the envelope again, as if protecting the documents inside from the weight of the moment. I realized that the quiet seriousness I had noticed earlier was not fear, but responsibility. He had been carrying the truth alone, while making sure it was accurate. That is why I hired the genealogist, he continued. I needed confirmation from official records, not just a computer report. I needed to know whether the connection was real or just a misunderstanding. I studied his face, recognizing the determination that had always guided him through difficult decisions in our life together. When Daniel believed something mattered, he approached it carefully and completely. And once you knew the truth? I asked. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair and folded his hands together. Then I started remembering small things from my childhood, he said. Fragments of stories my aunt used to mention about my father moving away and starting over somewhere else. At the time, I never paid much attention. I was too young to understand that those details might matter one day. His voice softened slightly as he continued. I also remembered how little I truly knew about him. He disappeared from my life, so early that most of what I knew came from secondhand memories. Hearing that made me think again about the quiet man who had lived in my house when I was 16 years old. Richard Hayes had always seemed like someone carrying his own private history, a man who spoke kindly but rarely shared personal stories. He never talked much about his past with us either, I said thoughtfully. My mother would sometimes ask about his family, but he usually answered in very general ways. Daniel nodded slowly. That makes sense now, he said. It sounds like he was trying to begin a new life without bringing the earlier chapters with him. I considered that possibility for a moment. People sometimes reinvent themselves after difficult years, hoping that distance will soften whatever they left behind. Richard Hayes may have believed he was doing exactly that when he moved to Connecticut and eventually married my mother. What he could never have predicted was that his son and his stepdaughter would someday meet as strangers and fall in love. I looked across the table at Daniel again, feeling the strange mixture of surprise and clarity that had settled in my mind over the past hour. So when you discovered this connection, I said gently, what frightened you the most? Daniel met my eyes directly, and his answer came without hesitation. Not the truth itself, he said quietly. The only thing that worried me was whether the truth might hurt you. Those words stayed with me for a moment, warm and sincere in a way that reminded me exactly why I had chosen to spend my life with this man. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand again, realizing that even the most unexpected discovery could not erase the honesty that had always existed between us. Still, the more we spoke, the more one thought continued forming in my mind, a quiet question about the past that neither of us had fully explored yet. I glanced once more at the documents in the envelope and then back at Daniel. There is something else I keep wondering about, I said softly. If Richard Hayes was your father and later became my stepfather, why did he never recognize your name when my mother introduced us years later? I watched Daniel carefully as my question settled between us, and for a moment his expression changed in a way I had not seen earlier that evening. It was not fear exactly, and not surprise either. It looked more like recognition, as if he had already asked himself that same question many times before I finally spoke it aloud. He slowly leaned forward and rested his elbows lightly on the table, glancing down at the documents before answering. I wondered the same thing, he said quietly. In fact, that was one of the first things I asked the genealogist to investigate. The restaurant around us continued its calm evening rhythm, but my attention stayed completely fixed on Daniel's voice. I could feel the story moving closer to something important, something that had been hidden quietly inside our shared past for decades. According to the records, Daniel continued, when my aunt took me to Ohio, she legally changed my last name. I blinked in surprise. She did. Daniel nodded gently. Yes, my birth name was Daniel Hayes, but after my father left Pennsylvania and stopped contacting us, my aunt believed it would be easier if I grew up using her family name instead. That is how I became Daniel Whitmore. I sat back slightly in my chair, letting that detail settle into place. It explained something that had puzzled me since the beginning of our conversation. So when my mother introduced us to Richard Hayes all those years ago, I said slowly, your last name was already Whitmore. Exactly, Daniel replied. And by that time I had not seen my father in more than 20 years. I had no photographs of him, no recent memories, nothing that would have helped me recognize him. I thought back to that first evening when my mother brought Richard Hayes to dinner. Daniel had visited our house only once during that time while we were still dating in college. I remembered how polite he had been, shaking Richard's hand with the same respectful courtesy he showed everyone older than himself. At the time it had been an ordinary introduction between a young man and the new husband of his girlfriend's mother. Neither of them had any reason to suspect they were standing face to face with a forgotten connection from the past. Do you think he recognized you? I asked quietly. Daniel considered the question carefully before answering. I do not believe so, he said. The genealogist found a letter written by my aunt shortly after she took me in. In it she mentioned that my father had not been involved in my life for several years even before I moved away. It sounds like he had already started building a different life somewhere else. I imagined the man I remembered from my teenage years, the quiet way he used to sit in the living room reading the newspaper in the evenings, rarely speaking unless someone asked him a direct question. Perhaps he truly believed that the earlier part of his life had been closed forever. That means when you and I met in college, I said thoughtfully. There was absolutely no way either of us could have known about the connection. Daniel smiled faintly. None at all, he agreed. Two young people from different states meeting in a campus library does not usually lead anyone to examine their family histories. I could not help smiling slightly at that memory. Our first conversation had been about a history assignment, something simple and forgettable at the time. Yet somehow that small moment had eventually grown into 40 years of marriage, children, and grandchildren. It is strange to think that our lives crossed paths long before we ever realized it, I said softly. Daniel nodded in quiet agreement. Yes, he replied. But the truth is, Margaret, that connection existed only on paper. In every way that truly mattered, our lives began together. The day we met. His words carried a calm certainty that eased the last remaining tension in my chest. I looked down once more at the envelope resting on the table and realized that the documents inside were not a threat to our marriage. They were simply a reminder that life often contains hidden stories waiting to be discovered many years later. I reached forward and gently closed the envelope before sliding it back toward Daniel. Then perhaps this is simply another piece of family history, I said quietly. Daniel looked at me with the same warm expression that had greeted me across countless dinner tables over the years. Perhaps it is, he agreed. But as the candle flickered between us and the piano music shifted into another slow melody, I realized that one final thought still lingered in my mind, a question about the man whose choices had unknowingly shaped both of our lives long before we met. As I sat across from Daniel in that quiet restaurant, I realized that the story we had uncovered was not really about legal documents or forgotten records. It was about the strange ways life connects people without their knowledge. For a long moment, I watched the candlelight reflecting on the polished surface of the table while the music from the piano drifted gently through the room. Daniel's hand still rested near the envelope, but neither of us felt the need to open it again. The most important parts of the story had already been spoken aloud. You know, I said slowly, when I was 16 years old and my mother introduced Richard Hayes to me, I never imagined he had lived an entire life before meeting us. Daniel listened quietly, his expression thoughtful. Most people carry stories we never see, he said gently. Sometimes even their own families only know a small part of who they used to be. His words reminded me of the quiet evenings in our old house, when Richard Hayes would sit in the living room reading while my mother prepared dinner in the kitchen. He had always been polite, always respectful, but there was a distance around him that I never fully understood at the time. Now I realized that distance may have come from the memories he carried with him. I wonder if he ever thought about you, I said softly. Daniel considered the question for a moment before answering. Perhaps he did, he replied calmly. Or perhaps he believed the past was too complicated to revisit. There was no bitterness in his voice, only curiosity. That was something I had always admired about Daniel. Even when learning something unexpected, he approached it with patience rather than anger. I looked around the restaurant again, noticing how the evening had grown quieter as some of the earlier diners began leaving. A few candles had burned lower, and the pianist was playing a slower melody now, something reflective that seemed to match the thoughtful mood at our table. What matters most, Daniel continued, is that none of this changes what we built together. I felt a warm sense of agreement in my chest when he said that. Our life together had not been defined by the past of a man who died decades ago. It had been shaped by the choices Daniel and I made every single day since we first met. I thought about our wedding day, about holding our newborn daughter in a hospital room filled with sunlight, about teaching our son how to ride a bicycle down the quiet street in front of our house. Those memories belonged entirely to us. No document could change that. 40 years is a long time to share a life, I said quietly. Daniel smiled softly. Yes, he said, and every one of those years belongs to us, not to a story that happened before we met. I reached across the table again and gently squeezed his hand, feeling the familiar comfort that had always been there. The envelope with the documents now felt less like a shocking revelation and more like a historical record, something that explained a coincidence rather than threatened our future. Still, one thought lingered in my mind as I looked at Daniel again. Do you think our children should know about this? I asked carefully. Daniel paused for a moment, considering the question with the same thoughtful patience he always showed when something important came up in our family. Eventually, Yes, he answered. Not because it changes who we are, but because honesty has always been part of this family. His answer felt right to me. Our children were adults now, capable of understanding that life sometimes reveals surprising connections without changing the love that binds a family together. The truth about Richard Hayes might surprise them, but it would not erase the decades of memories they shared with us. As the evening continued and the restaurant grew quieter, I realized something else as well. The story Daniel had given me that night was not a confession or a burden. It was simply the final missing page of a much older chapter, one that had quietly closed long before our own story began. For a while, Daniel and I simply sat there in the warm glow of the restaurant lights, letting the quiet settle around us like a calm evening after a long storm. The envelope containing the documents remained on the table between us, but neither of us felt the urgency to open it again. The truth it carried had already been spoken, and somehow the room felt lighter now that it was no longer hidden. I looked at Daniel and realized that despite everything we had discussed that night, the man sitting across from me was still the same person who had walked beside me through every season of my adult life. The same man who had stood nervously beside me on our wedding day, who had held my hand in hospital waiting rooms when our children were born, who had quietly fixed things around the house on Saturday mornings while humming songs from the radio. None of that had changed. You know something? I said softly after a moment. Daniel lifted his eyes toward me with that familiar patient expression. What is that? He asked. I smiled gently and glanced toward the candle flickering between us. When you first handed me that envelope tonight, I thought my entire world was about to fall apart. Daniel let out a small breath that almost sounded like a laugh. I was afraid you might think that, he admitted. That is why I spent 3 months making sure every detail was correct before I said anything. I nodded slowly, appreciating the care he had taken. But the strange thing is, I continued, the more we talked about it, the more I realized that the truth did not change our story. It only explained something that happened long before it. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, listening. The restaurant had grown quieter now, with only a few tables still occupied, and the piano player finishing what sounded like his last song of the evening. Life is full of coincidences, Daniel said thoughtfully. Some of them are small, and some of them feel almost unbelievable. But in the end, what matters most is the choices people make afterward. I knew exactly what he meant. Our life together had never been built on the actions of Richard Hayes or the decisions he made decades earlier. It had been built on patience, kindness, forgiveness, and thousands of small moments that slowly turned 2 young strangers into a family. I reached across the table again and took Daniel's hand, feeling the warmth of his fingers in mine. 40 years ago, I said quietly, we met in a college library and started talking about a history assignment. Daniel smiled at the memory. I remember you correcting my notes, he said with a gentle laugh. You told me I had the wrong date written down. Well, I replied softly. It seems like life has been correcting a few details in our history tonight as well. We both laughed quietly at that, not because the situation was funny, but because it finally felt understandable. The past had revealed one more piece of itself, but it had not changed the direction our lives had taken together. After a moment, Daniel picked up the envelope and slipped the documents back inside the small box he had brought with him. So what do we do now? He asked calmly. I thought about the question for only a second before answering. We finished celebrating our anniversary, I said with a warm smile. Because no matter what those papers say, this day still belongs to us. Daniel looked at me for a long moment, and I could see the quiet relief in his eyes. Then he nodded. The waiter returned to our table a few minutes later to ask if we would like coffee before leaving, and Daniel ordered 2 cups the way he always did. As the warm aroma filled the air and the last notes of music faded in the background, I realized something important about the strange story we had uncovered that evening. The discovery that Daniel's father had once been the man who later married my mother did not rewrite our marriage. It simply reminded us that life sometimes connects people in ways they never expect. And in the end, the only part of the story that truly mattered was the life Daniel and I chose to build together, day by day, year by year, until 40 anniversaries had quietly passed, and we were still sitting across from each other, holding hands, exactly where we belonged.